In the spring of 1971, at a mill clearance sale outside of Iroquois, Wisconsin, a 31-year-old woman named Lorene Schrock paid $45 for what the mill manager described with visible embarrassment as a mixed lot of unsaleable roofing tin. That was the charitable version. What Lorene actually bought was 11 years of accumulated mistakes. Sheets bent on the slitter, coils that had crowned in storage, panels crimped at the hem by a press that had gone out of alignment sometime around 1962 and never been properly reset. The mill had been stacking the rejects against the back fence in rough bundles, banding them with whatever wire was nearby, and leaving them in the weather because nobody had ever decided what else to do with them. There were panels with rust blooming at the cut edges. There were sheets with the galvanizing bubbled from freeze-thaw cycling. There were lengths that had been walked on, rolled over by a forklift, and bent at angles that suggested the forklift operator had been having a difficult week. The mill manager told the small crowd gathered at the sale that the lot was being offered as scrap weight, that he made no representations about condition, and that if anyone wanted to bid on it, they were welcome to, but he personally wouldn't recommend it. The scrap dealer from La Crosse opened at $12. Nobody moved. He raised his own bid to $18, which was still essentially an offer to haul it away. Lorene Schrock bid $22. The scrap dealer looked at her. She looked at the tin. He bid $25. She bid $45. And the scrap dealer shrugged and stepped back. And the mill manager brought the hammer down, with the expression of a man who had expected this to take longer. Lorene's brother-in-law, Harlan, was standing beside her. He said, "Lorene, what in the world are you going to do with bent tin?" She said, "Straighten it." He said that wasn't what he meant. She said she knew. The story traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties. From the mill yard to the feed store on Main Street. From the feed store to the co-op on County Road D. From the co-op to the lunch counter at Darlene's Cafe on the square. From the cafe to the church parking lot after the 11 o'clock service. By the time it reached the church parking lot, it had grown to include details nobody present at the mill sale could have witnessed, including the suggestion that Lorene had paid good money for tin that was so far gone even the rust was embarrassed to be on it. People laughed about it the way people in small counties laugh about things that confirm what they already suspected. Not cruelly, exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a community that has decided something is true and found evidence to support it. The thing they had decided about Lorene Schrock was that she was stubborn in ways that would eventually cost her. The $45 seemed to prove it. They laughed about it through the summer of 1971. They were still laughing quietly at the co-op through the fall. They stopped laughing, not all at once, but gradually, the way a room goes quiet when someone says something that reframes everything that came before it, sometime around 1979. But we'll get to that. Let me tell you about Lorene Schrock. Because what she did with that bent tin and with the 11 years of bent tin that came after it only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from and what she had been taught to see when other people saw waste. Lorene was born in 1940 on a farm outside of Iroquois in Vernon County, Wisconsin, the second of 4 children born to Walter Schrock and his wife, Edna. Walter Schrock was a sheet metal fabricator, not a hobbyist, not a man who kept a few tools in a shed and called himself handy. Walter had learned the trade from his own father in the 1920s, had worked for a roofing and siding contractor in La Crosse through the Depression, and had come back to Vernon County after the war with enough saved to buy 80 acres and enough skill to build every structure on it himself. The shop behind the farmhouse had a concrete floor poured in 1947 that Walter had floated himself to a tolerance he was proud of. There was a 10-foot sheet metal brake he had bought used from a lacrosse contractor in 1949 for $60 and rebuilt over one winter until it ran true. There was a hand-operated slip roller, a shear, a set of tin snips in 4 sizes hung on a pegboard in the order Walter had acquired them, and a stack of reference cards Walter had written himself in pencil on index stock, documenting the gauge tolerances and bend radii he had worked out by trial for every common roofing profile he had ever encountered. The cutting oil for the shear was in a can on the shelf above the blade. It had been there since 1951. It was still there when Lorraine used the shear for the first time on her own in 1971, and the oil was still good. Walter taught Lorraine the trade the way farmers teach children, things they consider important, through proximity and repetition, without formal announcement. She was handing him tools by the time she was 8. She was operating the brake under supervision by 12. By 15, she could lay out a standing seam panel from scratch, cut it to length, hem both edges, and fit it to a roof section without being told the sequence. Walter did not make a ceremony of this. He told her she had good hands and went back to work, which from Walter Schrock was the equivalent of a standing ovation. What he also taught her in the same unremarked way was how to look at a piece of damaged metal and determine whether it was damaged past use or damaged past its first use, which were not the same thing. He taught her that a bend in sheet metal is a stress event, not a death sentence. He taught her that galvanized steel, properly cleaned and recoated, will outlast the man who bent it. He taught her that the difference between scrap and material is almost always a question of whether someone is willing to do the work of finding out. Lorraine had a scholarship offer from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1958. She had a suitcase packed. She had a bus ticket purchased. Her father had a heart attack in August of that year, and the suitcase stayed in the bedroom, and the bus ticket stayed in the drawer of the nightstand where she had put it, and Lorraine stayed in Vernon County. She did not discuss this as a sacrifice. When it came up years later, she said she had made a choice, and choices were not the same as sacrifices, and she preferred not to confuse the two. Walter recovered partially, but never fully, and Lorraine took over the farm's day-to-day operation through the early 1960s, while her brothers moved to Eau Claire and Milwaukee respectively, and her younger sister married a man from Richland County. Walter died in March of 1967. He left Lorraine the farm, the shop, and the tools, all of it paid for, no mortgage, no equipment debt, no liens of any kind. He also left her a savings account at the First National Bank in Viroqua with $14,200 in it, which Walter had accumulated over 20 years by the simple method of spending less than he earned every single year, without exception. Lorraine deposited the inheritance, kept the account at the same bank, and continued the same method, not because she was afraid of money, because the ledger told her the truth about her operation, and Lorraine Schrock preferred truth to comfort. Now, the bent tin. When Lorraine looked at those 11 bundled lots stacked against the back fence of the Viroqua mill yard in the spring of 1971, she did not see what the mill manager saw, which was a liability. She did not see what the scrap dealer saw, which was weight. She did not see what Harlan saw, which was $45 thrown at a problem that wasn't hers. What she saw was feedstock. Let me tell you what Lorene knew that Vernon County didn't. 3 months before the mill clearance sale in January of 1971, Lorene had driven to a farm equipment swap meet in Sparta, 40 miles east on Highway 90, and had come home with something that was not on the swap meet's official program. She had come home with a conversation, specifically a conversation with a retired roofer from Monroe County named Aldous Frey, who was selling off his tools and who mentioned in passing the way retired men mention things they assume everyone already knows, that there was a steady market among Amish and Mennonite communities in western Wisconsin and eastern Iowa for salvage roofing tin, provided it was properly flattened and rehemmed, because those communities built constantly, built with their own labor, and bought materials on the basis of cost and longevity rather than appearance. Aldous said he had supplied a few communities himself in the 1960s before his back went. He said the communities paid in cash, paid promptly, and were not particular about whether the tin had been bent before as long as it was flat now, and the galvanizing was sound. He said the market was essentially unserved because nobody with the equipment to process the material was interested in the margin, and nobody interested in the margin had the equipment. Lorene drove home on Highway 90 and spent the rest of January working out the numbers on paper at the kitchen table. She had the equipment. She had the skill. She had the shop. The only thing she needed was the feedstock, and the feedstock was sitting in the Viroqua mill yard, being rained on and waiting for someone to decide it was worth $45. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing impulse. They were watching execution. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because this is where Lorene proved that the difference between a buyer and a builder is not equipment or money, but the willingness to do arithmetic before you spend either one. She started processing the first lot in April of 1971, evenings after chores, weekends when the weather kept her out of the fields. The shop was cold in April, and she kept the wood stove going and worked by the overhead fluorescent Walter had wired in 1953. The first task was assessment. She went through every sheet in the 11 bundles and sorted them into 3 categories: flat enough to rehem and sell as is, bent but recoverable through the break, and bent past recovery. The third category was smaller than she had expected. About 8% of the total weight was genuinely past use, and she set that aside for the actual scrap dealer. The rest, 92% of what she had paid $45 for, was recoverable. The brake was the key tool. Walter's 10-foot brake could reverse a bend as cleanly as it could make one, provided you understood the spring-back characteristics of the gauge you were working with and set your back gauge accordingly. Lorene had been running this brake for 19 years. She knew its spring-back by feel. She knew that 26-gauge galvanized would spring back approximately 3 degrees on a 90-degree bend, and that you compensated by setting the clamping bar 2 degrees past target and releasing slowly. She knew that a panel with a compound bend, bent in 2 directions, had to be worked in sequence. The secondary bend corrected first, the primary bend second, or the metal would work harden at the intersection and crack. Walter's reference cards were on the shelf above the brake. She consulted them occasionally, not because she needed them, but because they were Walter's handwriting, and she found that steadying. The rehemming was the finish work. A standing seam panel needs a clean hem at both long edges, a folded lip that locks into the adjacent panel's hem to form the seam. Bent panels had typically damaged their hems in the bending event. Lorene ran every recovered panel through the break a second time to reform the hem, then checked the hem gap with a gauge Walter had ground himself from a piece of flat stock and kept hanging on a nail by the slip roller. Panels that passed the gauge check were stacked on the shop floor in bundles of 20, banded with the wire she had saved from the mill's original bundles, and tagged with a card noting the gauge, the profile, and the length. The costs in the sequence she incurred them: $45 for the original lot, $4 for replacement banding wire, $6 for zinc-rich cold galvanizing compound to touch up cut edges and any spot where the original coating had lifted, $2 for the gauge check cardstock and pencils, $11 for a new set of brake clamping pads Walter had been meaning to replace since 1968, $1.70 for the wood to keep the stove going through April. Total, $69.70, including the purchase. The first lot produced 412 linear feet of recoverable standing seam panel in 26 gauge and 28 gauge profiles. She sold the first delivery to an Amish community outside of Westby in June of 1971 for $186, cash, paid by the deacon at the end of the driveway without ceremony or negotiation, because the price was fair, and both parties knew it. She netted $116.30 on a $69.70 investment in 8 weeks of evenings and weekends. She wrote the figures in the ledger, closed the ledger, and went back to the mill to ask when the next clearance lot would be available. Let me tell you about the next 8 years, because this is where the story stops being about bent tin and starts being about something else entirely. The mill agreed, after some discussion, to set aside their reject and clearance lots for Lorene on a standing basis rather than bundling them into general clearance sales. The arrangement suited the mill because it removed the problem of accumulation and the embarrassment of selling scrap weight in front of paying customers. It suited Lorene because it gave her a reliable feedstock supply at prices that ran between $30 and $60 per lot, depending on volume and condition. She processed lots in the shop through 1971, 1972, and 1973, selling to Amish and Mennonite communities in Vernon, Crawford, and Richland counties, and beginning in 1974, to communities across the border in northeastern Iowa. By 1975, she had added a second supply source, a roofing contractor in La Crosse, who had been landfilling his job site cutoffs and offcuts for years, and who was willing to deliver them to her farm for the cost of the fuel, because it was cheaper than the landfill fee. By 1976, she had a third source, a building materials dealer in Sparta, who had been storing water-damaged inventory in a back warehouse and who sold her the lot for $80, because the alternative was disposal. She added a used 8-foot shear to the shop in 1973 for $90 from an estate sale in Richland Center. She added a second brake, a smaller 6-foot unit, better suited to short panels, in 1975 for $120 from the same La Crosse contractor who had been supplying her cutoffs, who was upgrading to a 12-foot unit and had no use for the old one. She added a propane torch and a set of soldering irons for flashing work in 1976. Total equipment investment through 1976, $310, plus Walter's original shop, which had cost her nothing because Walter had paid for it in 1947 and left it to her clear. By 1977, Lorene Schrock was processing between 8 and 12 tons of salvage roofing tin per year, selling to approximately 40 communities and small contractors across 3 states, and netting between $4,000 and $6,000 annually above her farm income. She kept every dollar of it in the savings account at First National in Viroqua, in the same account Walter had started, drawing from it only once in 1974 to replace the farmhouse roof with her own salvage material installed by herself on 3 consecutive Saturdays in September at a material cost of $0 because the panels were her own inventory, and a labor cost of $0 because the labor was her own. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone for so long that the underestimation became invisible, stick with me. Because what happened in Vernon County between 1977 and 1983 is the part of this story that Lorene never talked about publicly, and the part that explains everything. Let me tell you about what happened in those years, because this is where the story stops being about Lorene Schrock and starts being about what it costs a county to be wrong for a decade. You know what happened to farming in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Interest rates climbed through 1979 and 1980 into territory that farm lenders had not planned for and farm borrowers could not absorb. The Federal Reserve's prime rate hit 21.5% in June of 1982. Land values in western Wisconsin, which had been rising through the 1970s on the assumption that they would continue rising, began to fall. Corn prices, which had been strong through the mid-1970s, softened. Operating loans that had been manageable at 8% became catastrophic at 16%. Farmers who had expanded on borrowed money in the good years, who had bought the neighbor's 80 acres on a variable rate note, who had financed the new combine on a 7-year loan, who had put in a new grain bin on a line of credit, found themselves in a position that no amount of hard work and good weather could resolve, because the problem was not the farming. The problem was the arithmetic. Vernon County lost 41 farms between 1979 and 1985. Not 41 farmers who retired. 41 farms that went to auction or to the bank or to a land company out of Madison that nobody in the county had ever met. Lorene watched this happen from her farm on the county road with the same expression she brought to most things: attentive, quiet, not without feeling. She watched Harold Meyer, whose family had farmed the ridge above her south field since 1921, sell his equipment at auction in November of 1981 and move to a rental house in Viroqua. She watched the Detweiler operation, 3 brothers who had farmed adjoining parcels and expanded aggressively through the mid-1970s, go through a bank workout that consumed 2 years and one of the 3 farms. She watched the co-op's parking lot thin out on Tuesday mornings, which was when the farmers came in, because there were fewer farmers to come. She watched all of this, not with satisfaction, because Lorene Schrock did not experience other people's losses as her own vindication. She watched it with a quiet sadness that she kept to herself and recorded in no ledger. Her own expenses did not change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. The farm was paid for. The shop was paid for. The equipment was paid for. The salvage supply came in at between $30 and $80 a lot and went out at prices that covered the cost many times over. When interest rates rose, Lorene's cost of operation was unaffected because Lorene had no loans on which interest accrued. When land values fell, Lorraine's balance sheet was unaffected because Lorraine had no leveraged land position to mark down. When commodity prices softened, Lorraine's income from the salvage operation was unaffected because salvage tin is not a commodity with a futures market. She was, in the precise economic sense of the word, immune, not because she had predicted the crisis, because she had built an operation that had no exposure to the mechanisms that caused it. By the end of 1981, the savings account at First National held $91,000. Lorraine was 41 years old. In the spring of 1983, the Meyer farm, Harold's farm, the one on the ridge above her south field, the one that had been in the Meyer family since 1921, came to auction. The land company from Madison had held it for 18 months, had found no buyer at their asking price, and had consigned it to a county land auction with a minimum bid of $680 per acre on 120 acres. There were 6 bidders registered. 3 were land companies. 2 were neighboring farmers trying to add acreage. 1 was Lorraine Schrock. The bidding opened at $680. It moved in increments of $20. The 2 neighboring farmers dropped out at $740, which was the edge of what their operating lines would support. The land companies traded the bidding back and forth between $760 and $820 with the mechanical efficiency of people who were spending other people's money. At $840 per acre, one of the land companies dropped out. At $860, the second land company raised to $880. Lorraine bid $900. The land company paused. They bid $920. Lorraine bid $960. The land company conferred briefly and did not bid again. 120 acres at $960 per acre. Total, $115,200. Lorraine Schrock wrote a check from the First National account, not a cashier's check arranged in advance with a bank officer. A personal check from the account she had been adding to since 1967. The same account Walter had started in 1947, written with a pen she took from her coat pocket. The crowd at the auction went quiet, not politely quiet, not the quiet of people waiting for the next lot, the quiet of people rearranging everything they thought they knew about a woman they had been laughing about, in one degree or another, for 12 years. Harlan was there. He had his cap in his hands. He did not say anything. He was looking at the ground with the expression of a man who has just understood something that should have been obvious and is trying to decide how to feel about the fact that it wasn't. The auctioneer confirmed the bid, confirmed the payment method, and moved on to the next lot. Lorraine folded her copy of the bid confirmation, put it in her coat pocket with the pen, and walked back to her truck. She did not look at the crowd. She had not come to be seen. She had come to buy land. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Walter Schrock would have understood without a word of explanation. Lorraine farmed the expanded operation through the 1980s and into the 1990s. She added the Meyer acreage to her rotation, ran the salvage operation out of the same shop, added a 4th supply source in 1986 when a metal building contractor in Onalaska began routing his cutoffs to her rather than the landfill. By 1990, she was supplying salvage roofing material to communities and small contractors in Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois. She had no employees. She had no business loan. She had no truck payment. She had a 1968 Ford F-25 Oh, that she had bought used in 1972 for $400 and maintained herself using Walter's tools, and which she drove until 1994, when it required a frame repair she judged uneconomical, and she replaced it with a 1987 F2 5. Oh, she bought from an estate sale for $1,100. Her niece, Carol, her younger sister's daughter, came to work on the farm in the summers beginning in 1988, when Carol was 14. Carol had her mother's temperament and Walter's hands, which is to say she was patient and precise and not easily discouraged by work that required repetition. Lorene put her on the break the first summer, running rehems on 28-gauge panels, and watched her without comment until Carol's hem gap was consistent, and then told her she had good hands and went back to work. Carol recognized this as high praise because her mother had told her what it meant. In the fall of 1993, Lorene was invited to speak at the Vernon County Farm Bureau's annual meeting in Viroqua. She was 53 years old. She had been farming in Vernon County for her entire adult life and had never been asked to speak at anything. She accepted, which surprised the Farm Bureau's program committee, who had expected her to decline. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not use notes. She said that she had spent 22 years processing material that the market considered worthless and selling it to buyers who considered it valuable, and that the difference between those two judgments was not the material, but the labor applied to it, and that the labor was only possible because she owned the tools that performed it, and that she owned the tools because she had never borrowed money to buy something she could buy with savings if she waited, and that she had savings because she had spent 22 years selling material that the market considered worthless. She said this was not a strategy she had invented. She said her father had taught it to her in a shop on the county road, and she had been slow to understand that not everyone had been taught the same thing. She said she thought that was a shame. She sat down. Harlan was in the third row. He had been a member of the Farm Bureau for 30 years. After the meeting in the parking lot, he walked over to where Lorene was unlocking the F250 and said he owed her an apology for the mill sale in 1971. Lorene said he didn't. He said he thought he did. She said what she had needed in 1971 was not his approval, and she had managed without it, and she didn't hold the absence of it against him. She got in the truck. He stood in the parking lot for a moment with his cap in his hands, which was where his cap had been at the land auction 10 years before, and then he went to his own truck and drove home. Carol took over the salvage operation formally in 1997, when Lorene was 57, and had decided that her niece had an opinion about how many hours she spent on the concrete shop floor that she was prepared to respect. Carol had been running the operation alongside Lorene for 9 years by then, and knew every supply source, every community buyer, every quirk of the brake and the shear and the slip roller. She knew which gauge profiles the Amish communities in Iowa preferred, and which ones the Mennonite communities in Minnesota would substitute if the preferred gauge was short. She knew where Walter's reference cards were and had added 12 of her own, in the same pencil-on-index stock format hung on the same nail. She knew that the cutting oil for the shear was kept in the can, on the shelf above the blade, and that you checked the level before every long run. She was 33 years old, and she had good hands, and she owned the tools, and the tools were paid for. By 1997, the salvage operation that Lorene had started with $45 and a mill clearance lot in 1971 had generated, in aggregate, something in the neighborhood of $250,000 in net revenue above farm income, processed through the same shop, with the same brake, with tools that had cost Walter Schrock less than $300 to assemble over 20 years. The first national account, which Lorene had drawn from only twice, once for the farmhouse roof in 1974 and once for the Meyerland in 1983, held enough that Lorene was not concerned about her retirement and did not discuss the figure with anyone except the bank officer who had known her since 1967 and who had learned over 30 years not to ask questions she hadn't invited. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a bent piece of roofing tin? Most people see scrap. They see the end of something. They see weight and rust and the residue of someone else's mistake. Lorene Schrock saw feedstock. She saw the gap between what the market had decided something was worth and what it would be worth after someone with the right tools and the right knowledge applied the right labor to it. She saw her father's brake. She saw $45 and 69 cents and $116.30 on the other side of 8 weeks of evenings. She saw 26 years of the same arithmetic, compounded. The mill said nobody wanted bent tin. She wanted it. That's the difference between someone who buys what the market offers and someone who builds what the market hasn't figured out yet. $45, a machinist's daughter, a 10-foot brake that Walter Schrock bought used in 1949 and never stopped paying for, because a tool you own outright keeps paying you back until there's nobody left to run it. And then it waits for someone who can.